How many of these letters can you read and understand? If you can recognize even one, the Phoenicians have already touched your life. Every modern alphabet, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Hebrew, Arabic, traces its origins to a single invention created by ancient seafarers living along the narrow shores of present-day Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. These were the Phoenicians, masters of the Mediterranean, who built their power not through conquest, but through commerce. The name Phoenicians comes from the Greek word phenos, meaning purple or crimson, a nod to their most famous and valuable product, Tyrian purple dye, once worth more than gold. Unlike the great empires that rose and fell around them, the Phoenicians never formed a single unified state. Instead, their land was a constellation of independent city-states: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Beirut, Tartus, and others. Each had its own king and its own gods, but all shared a common language, culture, and script. This was their strength. While each city pursued its own interests, together they dominated Mediterranean trade for more than 1,000 years. The first Phoenician settlements appeared in the early Bronze Age, along a narrow stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the Lebanon Mountains to the east, around 3200 BC. The earliest inhabitants founded small coastal towns such as Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon. The origins of the Phoenicians have long been debated. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed that they migrated to the Levant from the region of the Erythraean Sea, somewhere near the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, in the early 3rd millennium BC. Most modern scholars, however, believe the Phoenicians were indigenous to the Levant, living along this coast for thousands of years. They even called themselves Canaani, meaning Canaanites, highlighting their deep connection to the land. Between 3200 and 1500 BC, these coastal communities evolved from small fishing and farming villages into prosperous trading centers. They established commercial ties with Egypt and Anatolia, and steadily refined their maritime skills, building increasingly advanced ships capable of long-distance travel. The major Phoenician cities lined the Mediterranean coast. Sidon held the leading position as first, but was eventually overtaken by Tyre, the city that came closest to being considered a capital if Phoenicia could be said to have had one at all. At its height, Tyre was home to more than 50,000 people, an extraordinary number for the time. Uniquely, the city was divided between the mainland and a heavily fortified island just offshore. To the north stood Sidon, Tyre's ancient rival for supremacy among the Phoenician city-states, and at times its loyal ally against foreign threats. Further north lay Byblos, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, a spiritual center and a place where shipbuilding reached its peak. Other important cities included Beirut, Arwad, Sarepta, and Tripoli, with tons of smaller ports and settlements scattered between them. Each city-state governed itself and maintained its independence. Each had its own patron gods, though all shared a common pantheon, headed by Baal and Astarte. This political fragmentation might seem like a weakness, but in reality, it made the Phoenicians exceptionally resilient. If one city fell to invasion, the others endured. They survived not through overwhelming military power, though they could fight when necessary, but through adaptability, commerce, and the skill of yielding just enough to avoid being broken. The Phoenicians were natural sailors. Their mastery of the sea allowed their trade routes to stretch across the entire Mediterranean, from the Near East to Spain. Homer, in the Odyssey, praised their ships as unmatched, while Herodotus called them the finest navigators of their time. And with good reason, the Phoenicians were true pioneers of maritime technology. Their innovations in shipbuilding were remarkable. They developed a curved hull that improved both stability and speed. They invented the keel, a sturdy spine along the bottom of the ship that prevented capsizing and allowed for more precise steering in open water. They also began sealing the gaps between wooden planks with resin, making their ships more watertight and durable. These advancements sparked a technological revolution in seafaring, turning the Phoenician fleet into the dominant naval force of the Mediterranean. But their rise to maritime supremacy was not immediate. Until around 1500 BC, the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete commanded the Mediterranean. With a powerful commercial and military fleet, the Minoans controlled sea routes from Spain to Egypt. The Phoenicians, confined to the eastern coastline, were limited to local coastal trade during this time. But around 1500 BC, everything changed. The stratovolcano on the island of Tyre, modern Santorini, erupted with colossal force. Researchers estimate the explosion was equivalent to 200 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The resulting tsunami swept across the Mediterranean, destroying the Minoan fleet and devastating their coastal cities. The Minoans never recovered, and soon their civilization fell to the first Greeks, the Mycenaeans. The Phoenicians stepped into the power vacuum and claimed control of trade routes they had never dreamed possible. This was the beginning of their dominance over the Mediterranean. They built three primary types of ships. Warships were fast and agile, designed to escort valuable cargo and defend trade routes. Large merchant ships were engineering masterpieces, capable of carrying up to 450 tons of goods, a capacity unmatched in the Mediterranean for more than 1,000 years. They also constructed smaller vessels for fishing and short coastal voyages, ideal for local trade between nearby ports. And when Phoenician merchants embarked on long-distance expeditions, they never traveled alone. Their merchant fleets could number more than 50 ships, accompanied by warships to protect against pirates and rival traders. Now, where did they sail? Everywhere. The Phoenicians founded colonies and trading posts across the Mediterranean, in Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, Cyprus, and beyond. They weren't interested in conquering vast territories in the traditional sense. What they needed were ports, way stations, trading partners, and sources of raw materials for their workshops. Their expansion unfolded in two phases. From the 12th to the 8th century BC, they established trading posts and seasonal settlements, places where ships could be repaired, supplies replenished, and goods exchanged with local peoples. Then, between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, many of these stations evolved into full-fledged colonies, true cities that became outposts of Phoenician culture on distant shores. The scale of Phoenician trade is staggering. They sailed as far as Cornwall in what is now Britain to obtain tin, a vital component of bronze. According to one theory, the very name Britain derives from the Phoenician Baratenang, meaning land of tin. Herodotus recounts an even more daring expedition. Around 600 BC, at the command of the Egyptian pharaoh Necho, Phoenician sailors supposedly circumnavigated Africa 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama. According to his account, the voyage lasted 3 years. The sailors would disembark to plant and harvest crops as they traveled. In the 20th century, a cave painting was found in North Africa that closely resembles a Phoenician merchant ship and dates to around 600 BC. Whether the voyage truly happened remains debated. A single cave painting is not conclusive evidence. But the very fact that Herodotus considered such a feat plausible speaks volumes about the Phoenicians' reputation as sailors. As Phoenician settlements spread across the Mediterranean, they evolved. What began as simple coastal camps, little more than convenient beaches for docking ships and storing goods, gradually transformed. As tensions with local populations grew, these places became fortified and militarized. Walls were built, garrisons established, and temporary trade outposts turned into permanent colonial cities that maintained close economic and cultural ties with their homelands in the Near East. Among all these colonies, one stood above the rest: Carthage. Founded in 814 BC on the coast of modern-day Tunisia as a colony of Tyre, it quickly became a powerful state in its own right. After the Phoenician cities in the Levant fell under the control of Assyria and the neo-Babylonian Empire, Carthage rose to lead the Phoenician world abroad. At its height, Carthage commanded a vast commercial empire, spanning North Africa, southern Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. The city that endured for nearly 7 centuries until it was destroyed by Rome in 146 BC at the end of the Third Punic War. But whenever I read about fallen civilizations like Carthage, I can't help but wonder, if everything we built disappeared tomorrow, libraries, computers, the internet, how would we even start again? What would we need to rebuild a civilization after such a collapse? That's exactly the question explored in this book. The ultimate guide to rebuilding a civilization. Just look at this. It's a beautifully illustrated encyclopedia that dives into the knowledge humanity has gathered over thousands of years. Everything from forging metal and building aqueducts to writing systems, philosophy, and government. It's honestly one of the most fascinating things that I've picked up lately. I keep catching myself flipping through it at night thinking, oh, this would have changed everything for the Babylonians, or the Romans would have loved this section on engineering. The art style feels like something straight out of a medieval manuscript. It's detailed, textured, and beautiful. There's even a secret coded quest hidden through the pages, which I'm still trying to solve. If you love history and world building, this is one of the books that just pulls you in. It's not just about the past, it's about how the knowledge survives when everything else collapses. Check out the link in the description below, and if you decide to get your copy, use the code Parabellum for a discount as well. Now, back to the Phoenicians. If you asked an ancient Greek or Roman what they most associated with Phoenicia, the answer would come instantly: purple dye. Most specifically, Tyrian purple. This dye was so rare, richly colored, and difficult to produce that it became a symbol of power, luxury, and royal authority. It was this very commodity that made Phoenician cities fabulously wealthy, and even gave them their name. Tyrian purple was made from murex sea snails found in the Mediterranean. Producing it was long, exhausting, and foul-smelling work. To obtain just 1 gram, enough to dye the trim of a garment, around 10,000 snails were needed. Each snail had to be gathered, cracked open, and its tiny gland removed. The contents were then dried in the sun, where a chemical reaction produced the deep purple pigment. The stench was so overpowering that dye workshops were built outside of city walls, downwind from the population. The scale of production was immense. In Sidon, archaeologists uncovered a mound of crushed murex shells 50 meters high, evidence of centuries of dye making. A medieval fortress now stands atop it. The Phoenicians harvested the snails so intensively that some species used for the finest purple dye were driven to near extinction. Workers who handled the dye daily had their hands and forearms permanently stained, marks that could not be washed off. Herodotus wrote that the Greeks called the Phoenicians the purple people because of these unmistakable, indelible stains left by their craft. The dye was worth more than gold. Only the wealthiest could afford garments fully dyed in Tyrian purple. Emperors, kings, high priests all wore it. Purple became the color of wealth, power, and divinity. But it was far from their only valuable export. The Phoenicians also traded Lebanese cedar, majestic trees that grew in the nearby mountains. Cedar was prized across the ancient world for its strength, fragrance, durability, and resistance to insects. The Egyptians used it to build ships and sarcophagi. The Assyrians used it for palaces and temples. The Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was also built from Lebanese cedar, and according to the Bible, King Solomon gave King Hiram of Tyre 20 towns as payment for timber and craftsmen. Phoenician artisans were renowned through the Mediterranean. They worked with wood, ivory, metal, and textiles, producing goods in high demand. They perfected or greatly advanced the art of glass blowing, creating jewelry, decorative objects, and perfume bottles that were both beautiful and practical. The craftsmanship blended influences from many cultures: Aegean, North Syrian, Cypriot, Assyrian, and Egyptian, into a uniquely Phoenician style. Of all the Phoenicians' contributions to world civilization, one stands above the rest: the alphabet. Before them, writing systems were complex and difficult to learn. Egyptian hieroglyphs used hundreds of signs. Mesopotamian cuneiform required knowing countless wedge-shaped symbols that represented syllables, words, or entire ideas. Mycenaean Linear B was similarly intricate. These systems worked, but they were so demanding that literacy was reserved for professional scribes who spent years in training. The Phoenician alphabet changed everything. It consisted of just 22 letters, each representing a single consonant sound. No pictograms for whole words. No complicated syllabic signs. Only simple symbols that could be combined to write any word in the Phoenician language. Learning to read and write suddenly became much easier and much faster. This simplicity sparked a revolution. The alphabet spread rapidly across the Mediterranean. In the second half of the 8th century BC, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician script and adapted it to their own language by adding vowels. And so the Greek alphabet was born. We even have physical evidence of this transition. An ancient artifact known as the Cup of Nestor, which bears a Greek inscription written with Phoenician characters. From Greek script came the Etruscan alphabet, followed by Latin, Cyrillic, and many others. And from the Phoenician script developed Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic writing. Every word that you're reading right now, whether on a screen or in a book, is written using a writing system that ultimately descends from those 22 Phoenician letters, created more than 3,000 years ago. It may well be the most important invention in human history. And yet, ironically, we know surprisingly little about the Phoenicians from their own writings. They mostly wrote on papyrus, an organic material that decays over time. Unlike stone or clay inscriptions, papyrus doesn't survive for millennia unless conditions are perfect. As a result, almost everything we know about the Phoenicians comes from other civilizations, in Greek, Egyptian, and Assyrian sources. At the dawn of their history, the Phoenician city-states lived in the shadow of stronger powers that vied for control of the Levantine coast. At different times, these dominant forces were Egypt, the Hittite kingdom, the Assyrian Empire, and others. In the early 13th century BC, two of these great powers, Egypt and the Hittite kingdom, clashed at the Battle of Kadesh and divided the Near East between them. Some Phoenician cities fell under Egyptian rule, while others under Hittite control. Yet even in these circumstances, the Phoenician cities retained a significant degree of autonomy, though they paid tribute to their overlords. The 12th century BC brought catastrophe to the entire eastern Mediterranean. This period, known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw the fall of great states that had dominated the region for centuries. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece were destroyed. The Hittite Empire, once a superpower across Anatolia, vanished from the map. Egypt survived, but was severely weakened and lost its foreign territories. The interconnected system of Bronze Age kingdoms crumbled, and with it disappeared international trade networks, diplomatic ties, and the relative stability that had defined the Late Bronze Age. For most peoples, the Bronze Age collapse was a disaster. For the Phoenicians, it became an opening. Their cities survived the turmoil almost untouched. Great empires crumbled, but the Phoenician city-states endured. Their fleets remained intact, and although their trade networks were damaged, they were not destroyed. In the power vacuum that followed, the Phoenicians emerged truly independent, no longer forced to bow to Egypt, the Hittites, or the Mycenaean Greeks, all of whom had either fallen or had been weakened. they gained unprecedented freedom to trade, explore, and establish colonies. The period from about 1000 to 800 BC is known as the Golden Age of Phoenicia, the height of its power and prosperity. The most renowned ruler of this era was Hiram I of Tyre, a contemporary of the biblical king Solomon. Under his reign, Tyre reached its zenith. On its island stronghold, he built grand structures and formidable defenses, turning the city into Phoenicia's greatest fortress. He restored ancient sanctuaries, adorned them with cedar, built a new temple dedicated to Melkart and Astarte, and made lavish offerings to the great temple of Zeus Balshaman, where he erected golden columns. Even Herodotus wrote about them with admiration. But the Golden Age could not last forever. The Phoenicians had flourished in part because the great empires had collapsed. And empires, like the tides, eventually return. The Assyrians survived the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt and Babylonia, though weakened, endured as well. By the late 9th century BC, these powers began to recover, expand, and reassert their influence. And the rich, independent Phoenician city-states appeared to them as a tempting prize. The empires that had collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age rose again, stronger and more ambitious than before. The first blow to the Phoenician cities came from Assyria. In the late 8th century BC, the neo-Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III annexed most of the Phoenician city-states. Only Byblos and Tyre retained limited autonomy, buying it with enormous tribute. Assyrian rule brought heavy taxes, interference in internal affairs, and the constant threat of brutal punishment for any hint of rebellion. The Phoenicians resented foreign domination, but offered little resistance. The Assyrians were infamous for their ruthless treatment of those who defied them. Only in the 6th century did Sidon rebel, and it was completely destroyed by the Assyrian king Esarhaddon. After Assyria's fall, the neo-Babylonian Empire became the dominant power in the Near East. In 585 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II laid siege to Tyre, a campaign that lasted 13 years. Part of Tyre stood on an island, making it nearly impossible to capture with a direct assault. While the Babylonians controlled the mainland coast, the Tyrians resupplied the city by sea. The conflict became a prolonged war of attrition. Eventually, both sides tired of the stalemate and agreed to peace. Tyre kept its formal autonomy, but acknowledged Babylonian suzerainty, and agreed to supply its fleet, effectively handing Babylon the powerful navy that it lacked. The long war left Tyre weakened, and it lost its place as the leading city of the Phoenician world. That role shifted to Carthage, which brought the Phoenician colonies of the Western Mediterranean under its leadership. Soon after, the Babylonians were replaced by a new rising power, the Persians. Around 540 BC, King Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon, and Phoenicia became part of the Persian Empire. At first, Persian rule was relatively lenient. The Persians were pragmatic rulers. They understood that granting autonomy could be more effective than ruling through fear. The Phoenician cities paid tribute and supplied ships for the Persian navy, and they kept much of their internal self-governance. Persian authority, while persistent, was not absolute. A striking example of this came after Cyrus's son Cambyses conquered Egypt. He planned an invasion of Carthage, but the Phoenician sailors, especially those from Tyre, refused to join the campaign. Carthage had been founded by Tyrians, and they would not fight their own kin. Rather than force their compliance and risk losing their loyalty, Cambyses abandoned the campaign altogether. The relationship between Phoenicia and Persia reached its most dramatic and tragic moment in 343 BC, when Sidon rose in rebellion. At first, King Tabnet of Sidon succeeded, He was supported by 4,000 Greek mercenaries and formed alliances with Cyprus and Egypt. Other Phoenician cities, including Tyre and Arwad, joined the revolt. But when news arrived that a vast Persian army was on its way, Tabnit panicked. He secretly wrote to King Artaxerxes III, offering to surrender in exchange for his own safety and that of Sidon. King Artaxerxes accepted the offer, but when Tabnit arrived at the Persian camp with 500 of Sidon's wealthiest citizens to negotiate, Artaxerxes had them seized and executed. When the people of Sidon realized they had been betrayed and that the Persians were entering their city, they shut themselves inside their homes with their families and set the city ablaze. According to the historian Diodorus, more than 40,000 people died in the flames. Word of Sidon's fate spread quickly. When the Persians marched toward Tyre and Arwad, both cities surrendered without resistance. In 332 BC, a young Macedonian king named Alexander marched through former Persian lands, conquering everything in his path. Most cities surrendered without resistance. Byblos opened its gates to him. Sidon, still scarred by the events of 11 years earlier, welcomed Alexander and handed over Persian officials. Such was their hatred of their former overlords. Tyre also sent envoys, declaring that they accepted Alexander's authority. But a problem soon arose. Alexander wished to offer a sacrifice to Hercules in Tyre's main temple, a symbolic act of claiming the city. The Tyrians refused. Perhaps they never truly intended to surrender, or perhaps they simply drew a line. No foreign conqueror would be allowed into their holiest sanctuary. Whatever the reason, Alexander was furious. He resolved to make Tyre an example. The siege of Tyre became one of the most famous military operations of the ancient world. The city was partially built on an island, separated from the mainland by a stretch of the sea. Alexander could not take it by a direct assault, so he ordered something unprecedented: the construction of a massive causeway, a land bridge of stone and soil stretching from the shore to the island. This would allow his army to reach the city walls. The Tyrians resisted fiercely, repeatedly sending ships to set the causeway on fire and attacking the workers with arrows, javelins, and spears. But Alexander did not relent. The siege lasted 7 brutal months. When Alexander's forces finally breached the walls and stormed the city, the result was devastating. Many of Tyre's inhabitants were killed in the assault. As punishment for their resistance, Alexander ordered 2,000 Tyrians to be crucified. Around 30,000 more were sold into slavery. Only a small number managed to escape to Carthage in the final moments before the city fell. After the conquest, Alexander offered a sacrifice to Hercules and held a ceremonial procession in his honor. The greatest city in Phoenicia was no more, its people scattered, its independence gone forever. Following Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals. Phoenicia came under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, Greeks who ruled from Syria. This marked the beginning of Hellenization, the gradual adoption of Greek language, customs, and culture. Phoenician identity did not vanish overnight, but it slowly dissolved into the wider Hellenistic world that Alexander had created. In 62 to 64 BC, Rome annexed Phoenicia, folding it into the province of Syria. The Phoenician cities continued to thrive as prosperous trade hubs, but the unique culture that had once defined them was all but gone. Their language gave way to Greek and Latin. Their gods were reinterpreted through Greek and Roman beliefs, and the memory of their former independence as city-states faded into the past. Carthage, the greatest of all Phoenician colonies, remained the last bastion of Phoenician culture for a century after Phoenicia itself had fallen to Alexander. But in 146 BC, after a series of brutal wars against Rome, Carthage too was destroyed. Its people were killed or sold into slavery. its buildings leveled, and according to legend, its fields were sown with salt, so nothing would ever grow there again. With the fall of Carthage, the final great center of Phoenician civilization disappeared. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. We put out new episodes every single week. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.